Don't touch what you don't understand. The sentence landed softly, but the room felt it like a shift in gravity, subtle, invisible, undeniable. Moments earlier, the tension had already been building, quiet but sharp, like pressure beneath glass. The restaurant sat 30 floors above downtown Manhattan, where the skyline stretched like a promise, and every table whispered money. Crystal glasses caught the amber light. A piano hummed somewhere near the bar, and conversations floated in polished tones, controlled, curated, important. At the center of it all stood Victor Liang, a billionaire CEO known not just for his success, but for the way he commanded space without raising his voice. His tailored suit fit like precision, his watch caught reflections like a signal, and his presence alone was enough to make people adjust their posture. He didn't look around the room. He didn't need to. The room revolved around him. And then there was Naomi Carter. Moving quietly between tables, she carried a tray balanced with effortless control, her posture steady, her expression neutral, the kind of calm that doesn't come from comfort, but from discipline. Most people didn't notice her. They never did. To them, she was part of the background, like the soft music or the dim lighting, something expected, something invisible. But Naomi noticed everything. The way Victor dismissed a server with a flick of his fingers. The way his guests laughed half a second too late. The way power moved, not loudly, but with certainty. She had seen this before. Not this exact room, not these exact faces, but this pattern. The quiet hierarchy. The unspoken rules. The belief that some people mattered more than others. When Naomi approached the table, she did what she always did. She served with precision. No wasted movement. No unnecessary words. But something shifted. A glass slightly out of place. A brief pause. A moment so small most wouldn't register it. Victor did. His eyes moved, sharp, calculating. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The air changed anyway. Conversations nearby softened. Attention redirected without anyone admitting it. And then came the moment. Quick. Controlled. But final. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to draw a line. Enough to remind the room who held power. Naomi didn't react the way people expected. No apology rushed out. No visible fear. Just stillness. The kind that makes people uncomfortable. The kind that forces attention. Her eyes met his, not in defiance, not in submission, but in something far more unsettling. Awareness. Around them, phones subtly tilted. A fork paused midair. Someone shifted in their chair. Victor leaned back slightly, the faintest hint of satisfaction crossing his face. The look of a man who believed the moment had already ended. That control had been established. That the story was his. But stories like this don't end where power expects them to. They pause. They wait. They gather. And in that silence, something unseen was already moving into place. Naomi adjusted her grip on the tray, steady as ever, but the room no longer felt the same. Because sometimes the most important shift isn't the action itself. It's what follows. And what follows was already beginning. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and sharp, like a wire pulled too tight. Naomi did not move right away. Not because she was frozen, but because she understood something most people in that room did not. Moments like this were not about reaction. They were about timing. She lowered the tray slowly, placing it on the edge of a nearby service stand with the same care she would use for crystal worth more than her monthly rent. Around her, the room tried to recover. A man cleared his throat. Someone forced a quiet laugh that landed nowhere. The piano resumed, softer now, uncertain, as if even the musician was waiting for permission to continue. Victor Liang adjusted his cuff, smooth and precise, as though the moment had already been filed away, handled, resolved. He reached for his glass, took a measured sip, and leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone who had never been challenged in a room like this. To him, this was routine. Control asserted. Boundaries reinforced. Order restored. But not everything in that room agreed. At a table near the back, a woman lowered her phone just slightly, her screen still glowing. Recording the aftermath no one was acknowledging out loud. Near the bar, a man in a navy suit stopped mid-sentence, his attention no longer on his client, but fixed on Naomi. And just beyond the line of soft lighting, near the private dining corridor, a figure who had remained unnoticed until now finally shifted his stance. Naomi straightened, her shoulders back, her breathing even. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, but she did not look around. She did not need to. She had lived long enough in rooms like this to know exactly when attention turned. What mattered was not who was watching. What mattered was what they were about to see. Victor set his glass down and gestured lightly, not even looking at her. A silent instruction. Continue. Move on. Return to your place. The kind of gesture that expected obedience without question. Naomi took a step forward. Not away. Not back to the kitchen. Forward. Just enough to change the geometry of the space between them. It was subtle. Most would not notice. But power notices distance. And power notices when distance is not restored. Victor's eyes lifted again, slower this time. Curious. Calculating. For the first time, there was something new behind his gaze. Not anger. Not yet. Interest. Because this was no longer routine. Naomi's voice, when it came, was calm, measured, almost quiet enough to miss. Sir, is there anything else you would like? It was a standard question, the kind she had asked hundreds of times. But tonight, it did not sound like service. It sounded like a line drawn with precision. Around them, the room leaned in without moving. The man near the corridor took one step forward, then stopped, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. Victor studied her now, fully, not as background, not as staff, but as a variable he had not accounted for. He did not answer immediately. He let the silence sit, testing it, measuring it. Then a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not warm, not kind, controlled. No, he said finally, his voice even. That will be all. Naomi nodded once. Professional. Complete. But she did not rush away. She turned with deliberate calm, each step steady, unhurried, as if the floor itself had shifted in her favor by half an inch. And sometimes, in rooms built on power, half an inch is all it takes to change everything. Because while Victor believed the moment had ended, something else had just begun. And this time, it was not moving according to his design. Naomi did not head straight to the kitchen. That was the first thing that changed. Anyone who knew the rhythm of a restaurant like this would have expected her to disappear behind the double doors within seconds, to dissolve back into the machinery of service, to become invisible again. But she did not. Instead, she paused near the service station, her hands resting lightly against the polished edge, her eyes lowered just enough to appear compliant, but not absent. It was a position most would read as routine. It was not. From there, she could see everything. Victor's table, the corridor, the reflection of the room in the mirrored column behind the bar. And more importantly, she could feel the shift continuing, subtle but undeniable, like a current running beneath still water. Victor resumed speaking with his guests, but something in his tone had changed. It was almost imperceptible, a fraction tighter, a fraction more deliberate, as though he was now performing control instead of simply possessing it. He laughed once, short and precise. His companions followed, but their laughter lagged by half a beat, not out of disrespect, but uncertainty. Because moments like this leave residue. They do not vanish. They linger in the air, altering how every word lands. Across the room, the man in the navy suit who had paused earlier stepped closer to the bar, his posture casual, his gaze anything but. He was not drinking. He was watching. Not Naomi alone, but the space between her and Victor, the invisible line that had not been restored. Naomi reached for a folded napkin, smoothing it out with slow, practiced movements. Her hands were steady, always steady. Years of balancing trays through crowded aisles, of carrying plates through rooms filled with people who never looked at her, had taught her control that no one could see unless they knew what to look for. And control, real control, does not announce itself. It waits. A manager passed behind her, close enough to whisper, "Are you all right?" The words were quick, careful, meant to disappear as soon as they were spoken. Naomi nodded once. No explanation. No complaint. Because this was not about comfort. It was about sequence. Timing. The order in which things unfold. The manager hesitated for half a second, then moved on, pulled back into the orbit of guests and expectations. Near the private corridor, the same unnoticed figure shifted again, this time stepping fully into the light. His suit was unremarkable, his expression neutral, the kind of man designed to blend into any environment. But now he was no longer blending. He was positioning. Naomi saw him in the reflection before she ever turned her head. Just a glance. just enough to confirm what she already understood. This was not coincidence. Back at the table, Victor placed both hands on the edge of the tablecloth, leaning forward slightly as he spoke, his voice low, confident, controlled. But his eyes flicked once, just once, toward Naomi's direction. Checking, measuring, because something in him had registered that the moment had not resolved the way it usually did. Power, when it is absolute, does not double-check. It assumes. The fact that he looked again meant something had shifted, even if he would never name it. Naomi picked up the tray once more, but she did not rush. Every movement was deliberate, every step placed with intention. She moved past the bar, past the mirrored column, and toward the corridor, crossing the path of the man who had stepped forward. For a brief second, they were side by side. No words, no acknowledgement, just alignment. And in that fleeting moment, the room continued its quiet performance, unaware that the story had already moved beyond what it could see. Because what was unfolding now was no longer about a single moment at a table. It was about everything that had been building long before anyone walked into that room. And the part no one could predict was already in motion. The corridor was quieter than the dining floor, but not silent. The kind of quiet that holds intention. Naomi walked through it without hesitation, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, as if she had made this walk 100 times before. Behind her, the soft murmur of the restaurant continued, polished and controlled, but it no longer reached her the same way. Here, the air felt different, cooler, more honest. The man who had moved from the shadows followed at a distance that was neither close nor far, precise enough to signal awareness without drawing attention. Naomi did not turn around. She did not need confirmation. She already knew. At the end of the corridor, a discreet door marked "Private" stood slightly ajar, its brushed metal handle catching a sliver of light. Naomi stopped just short of it, setting the tray down on a nearby console table. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes. Not in fear, not in doubt, but in calculation. Because everything from this point forward would no longer be invisible. The door opened wider before she could reach for it. A woman stepped out, mid-40s, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that spoke more of authority than fashion. Her gaze moved quickly, first to Naomi, then to the man behind her, then back again. A silent exchange passed between them, the kind built on preparation rather than surprise. "We are ready," the woman said, her voice low, controlled. Naomi nodded once. No questions, no hesitation. Inside the room, the lighting was brighter, cleaner, stripped of the warm illusion of the dining floor. A long table sat at the center, not set for dinner, but for something else entirely. Documents, devices, screens, the infrastructure of accountability. Naomi stepped inside, her reflection briefly catching in the glass panel along the wall. For the first time, she looked different. Not because she had changed, but because the context had. The uniform was still there, the apron, the name tag, but now, it looked less like identity and more like access. The man who had followed her entered next, closing the door with a quiet click that felt louder than it should have. He moved to the far side of the table, placing a slim folder down with deliberate care. "Timing aligns," he said, his tone neutral, professional. Naomi walked to the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the surface, grounding herself not in the room, but in the sequence she had already committed to. "He is still seated," she replied, her voice steady. "And he believes this is over." The woman in the charcoal suit allowed the smallest shift in her expression, something between acknowledgement and confirmation. "That is exactly where we need him." A screen flickered to life at the far end of the room, displaying a live feed of the dining floor. Victor's table appeared in sharp detail, every gesture, every glance captured without distortion. He was speaking again, composed, controlled, unaware that the perspective had changed. No longer the center. Now the subject. Naomi watched for a second, no longer as a server observing power, but as someone who understood its limits. "He does not like uncertainty," she said quietly. "He corrects it quickly." The man nodded. "Then we will not give him time to." The room settled into motion. Devices were adjusted. Signals confirmed. The kind of preparation that does not rush because it does not need to. Naomi stepped back slightly, her role shifting without announcement, from participant to catalyst. Because what mattered now was not what had happened at the table. It was what that moment had activated. Back on the screen, Victor reached for his glass again, his movement smooth, his expression unchanged. But there was something beneath it now. A flicker. A question he could not yet name. And sometimes, that is where control begins to slip. Not in the action, but in the space between certainty and doubt. Naomi exhaled slowly, her gaze steady. The room was ready. The timing was set. And for the first time that night, the balance was no longer in his hands. Back in the dining room, nothing looked different. That was the first illusion. The lights still glowed warm against polished glass. The piano still carried a soft rhythm through the air, and conversations resumed their measured pace, as if the earlier moment had already dissolved into the background. But underneath that surface, something had shifted direction. Not loudly, not visibly, just enough to begin pulling everything off balance. Victor Leong leaned slightly forward, his attention returning to the deal unfolding at the table, numbers and projections flowing between him and the investors seated across from him. His voice was steady, confident, the voice of a man who had closed billion-dollar negotiations without ever needing to raise his tone. He spoke in clean lines, controlled sentences, every word placed with intention. Yet between those words, there was a pause that had not existed before. A fraction too long, a glance too brief, the kind of hesitation most would never notice. But hesitation, once introduced, does not leave quietly. At the far edge of the room, near the bar, the man in the navy suit adjusted his position again, now standing where he could see both the table and the corridor exit. His expression remained neutral, but his focus had sharpened, no longer observing casually, but tracking. Near the host's stand, a second figure appeared, blending seamlessly into the staff rotation, clipboard in hand, posture relaxed. To anyone else, he was just another employee. To those who knew what to look for, he was something else entirely. The room had begun to populate with people who were not part of its design. Victor picked up his glass, but this time he did not drink immediately. He held it, just for a second, his eyes shifting toward the space Naomi had occupied earlier. Empty now, restored on the surface. But absence can be louder than presence when it arrives at the wrong moment. One of the investors spoke, outlining a projected return, his voice carrying numbers that should have commanded attention. Victor nodded, responding with precision, but his mind was no longer fully anchored to the conversation. Because control relies on predictability. And something in the sequence had broken. Across the room, a server passed by his table, placing a fresh bottle with practiced ease. The label faced outward. The placement exact. Victor acknowledged it with the smallest nod, but his gaze lingered a fraction too long on the movement, as if searching for something that was no longer there. The rhythm was off. Not enough to alarm, just enough to unsettle. And then it happened. Not a sound, not a gesture, a signal, subtle, coordinated. The man near the host's stand lifted his clipboard, adjusting the angle as if reviewing a note. At the same time, the figure near the bar shifted his stance, aligning his view directly with Victor's table. And in the private room, behind closed doors, a confirmation light turned from amber to green. Everything was now in motion. Victor set his glass down. This time, he did not mask the pause. His fingers rested against the table for a second longer than necessary, his gaze narrowing just slightly, as if trying to locate the source of a change he could feel but not define. Around him, the conversation continued, unaware, uninterrupted. But the room itself had begun to move differently. Not toward him, around him. And for the first time that night, the man who had always been at the center of control found himself in a position he had never prepared for. Not attacked, not confronted, simply surrounded by a sequence he did not control. And the most dangerous moments are not the ones you can see coming. They are the ones that arrive quietly, already unfolding, before you even realize you are part of them. The shift did not announce itself. It arrived through structure. At the main entrance, the glass doors opened with their usual quiet precision, letting in a brief wash of cooler air from the Manhattan night. Two individuals stepped inside, dressed in tailored suits that matched the tone of the room, neither overdressed nor out of place. To most guests, they were just late arrivals, perhaps investors or partners joining after another meeting. But they did not pause at the host's stand. They did not look around. They moved with direction, their pace measured, their focus fixed. Across the dining floor, the man near the bar straightened slightly, his posture aligning with theirs without acknowledgement. The figure near the host's stand closed his clipboard and stepped aside, clearing a path that no one else noticed had been created. And at the center of it all, Victor Liang felt it before he saw it. Not the people, not the movement, the pattern. Something had synchronized in a way that did not belong to him. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes lifting just as the two individuals approached his table. Conversation around him continued for half a second longer than it should have, then softened, like a wave pulling back from the shore. One of the men stopped at a respectful distance, his expression calm, professional, the kind of composure that carries authority without needing to declare it. "Mr. Liang," he said, his voice even, clear enough to be heard without drawing attention. Victor's gaze locked onto him instantly, sharp, assessing. "Yes," he replied, his tone controlled, but no longer casual. The man reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a small, folded document, holding it at chest level, not as a threat, but as a fact. "We need a moment of your time," he said. "No urgency, no aggression, just certainty." Around the table, the investors shifted slightly, their expressions tightening as the atmosphere changed from business to something else entirely. Victor did not reach for the document. Not yet. He studied the man instead, reading posture, tone, timing, calculating. Because this was not a disruption he had scheduled, and unscheduled events were variables he did not tolerate. "I am in the middle of a meeting," Victor said, his voice still steady, but now edged with something firmer. "A boundary." The man nodded once, acknowledging the statement without yielding to it. "We understand," he replied. "This will not take long." That was when the second man stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself just enough to close off the open space behind Victor's chair. Not blocking, not forcing, just redefining the geometry of the room. Victor noticed. Of course he did. His fingers rested lightly on the table, no longer relaxed, but deliberate, as if grounding himself in something he could still control. "On what basis?" he asked, his tone quieter now, more focused. The first man met his gaze directly. "On the basis of an ongoing investigation," he said. The words were simple, clean, but they carried weight far beyond their volume. Around them, the room did what rooms like this always do when certainty cracks. It listened without appearing to listen. Conversations lowered. Eyes shifted. Phones angled just slightly. Victor's expression did not break. Not fully, but something in his posture adjusted, the smallest recalibration of a man who understood, instantly, that the structure around him had changed. And across the room, unseen by most, the corridor door remained closed, the quiet operations behind it already complete. Because this moment was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be precise. And precision, when executed correctly, does not need force. It only needs timing. And the timing had just arrived. Victor Liang did not reach for the document immediately. That was the second illusion. Because men like him did not react, they assessed. His eyes moved from the man's face to the paper, then briefly to the second figure standing just behind him, and finally to the room itself, recalculating in real time. Every exit, every witness, every angle. He was not searching for escape. He was searching for leverage. "An investigation requires context," Victor said, his voice low, controlled, carrying just enough authority to remind everyone at the table who he was. "And I do not respond to interruptions without it." The first man nodded again, not dismissing the statement, but not yielding to it either. He unfolded the document slightly, just enough for the top line to be visible, though not readable to anyone beyond Victor's line of sight. "You will have full context," he replied. "But not here." The words landed with precision. Not here. That was the shift. Because this room, built for negotiation and dominance, was no longer the stage. It had been reduced to a setting, a background, and Victor understood that instantly. Around the table, one of the investors leaned back, distancing himself without making it obvious. Another reached for his phone, not to intervene, but to prepare. Because when power changes hands, people do not step in. They step aside. Victor's fingers tapped once against the table. Not nervous, not uncertain. A signal to himself. Think. Align. Control what can still be controlled. "Then you should schedule a proper meeting," he said, his tone sharpening slightly, testing the boundary again. "My office can accommodate, Mr. Liang," The man interrupted gently, not raising his voice, but closing the space between words with quiet authority. This is the proper setting for the next step. No aggression. No escalation. Just a line that did not move. And that was when it became undeniable. This was not a request. It was a transition. Victor leaned back fully now, his posture shifting from forward engagement to calculated distance. He exhaled once, slow, controlled, as if resetting his internal rhythm. Because resistance, in this moment, would not restore control. It would expose its absence. Across the room, more eyes had turned, though no one admitted it openly. The piano continued, but softer now, almost symbolic, like a performance continuing after the meaning had changed. Near the bar, the man in the navy suit adjusted his stance again, now facing directly toward Victor's table, no longer hiding his attention. And at the corridor door, still closed, the quiet work behind it had already completed its purpose. Victor finally reached for the document. Not quickly, not hesitantly, precisely. He took it between his fingers and glanced down, his eyes scanning just the first few lines. That was enough. The smallest shift crossed his expression. Not panic, not fear. Recognition. The kind that comes when a possibility becomes reality. He folded the document once, carefully, and placed it back on the table. Not rejecting it. Not accepting it. A pause. A controlled space. I see, he said quietly. 2 words. Measured, but no longer dominant. The man inclined his head slightly. Then you understand why we need you to step away from the table. Around them, the room had already begun to adjust, chairs shifting subtly, conversations dissolving into whispers, the invisible center of gravity moving away from Victor Leong. And for the first time that night, he did not immediately reclaim it. He stood slowly, his movements still composed, still deliberate, but no longer defining the room. Because the moment had crossed a line that could not be reversed. And once a man like Victor understands that, he does not fight the room. He studies what comes next. But what came next was no longer his to control. Victor Leong adjusted his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion, the kind that once signaled control but now felt like an attempt to preserve it. He did not rush. He did not protest. That was the third illusion. Because stillness, in moments like this, is often mistaken for power when it is actually calculation under pressure. The 2 men stepped slightly to either side of him, not touching, not guiding, but redefining his path forward. The table behind him no longer belonged to him. It had already moved on. One of the investors cleared his throat and began gathering his documents, not abruptly, but with quiet efficiency, as if closing a meeting that no longer required a conclusion. Another leaned back, avoiding eye contact entirely, his attention now fixed on his phone, where messages were already beginning to appear. Because news, in rooms like this, travels faster than words. Victor took a single step away from the table, then another, each movement measured, controlled, but no longer commanding. The center of the room did not follow him this time. It stayed behind, shifting toward absence rather than presence. And that was the difference. Near the bar, the man in the navy suit exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, as if marking the completion of a phase that had been in motion long before anyone sat down for dinner. The piano continued, but now it sounded distant, like a memory rather than a performance. As Victor moved across the dining floor, conversations parted without acknowledgement. Not out of respect, out of awareness. People did not want to be seen reacting. They wanted to be seen remaining untouched. That is how power distances itself when it senses a fall. At the edge of the room, just before the corridor, Victor slowed for a fraction of a second. Not hesitation. Observation. His eyes moved once more across the space, taking in the details he had previously owned. The lighting. The angles. The positioning of people who no longer oriented around him. And then his gaze stopped. Naomi stood near the corridor entrance, no longer holding a tray, no longer moving between tables. Still, composed, present in a way she had not been allowed to be before. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. There was no anger in hers, no triumph, just clarity, the kind that does not need to prove itself. Victor held that look for a second longer than expected, not because he wanted to, because he understood something had connected. A sequence, a cause, a consequence. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that would restore what had already shifted. The man to his right gestured gently toward the corridor. This way, he said, his tone unchanged, steady from the beginning to now. Victor nodded once. A small motion. Acceptance, not of defeat, but of reality. And he stepped forward. As he passed Naomi, the space between them felt different than it had minutes before. No longer defined by hierarchy. No longer framed by assumption. Just two individuals standing on opposite sides of a moment that had rewritten itself. Naomi did not move. She did not lower her gaze. She simply watched as he walked past, the sound of his footsteps fading into the corridor beyond. Behind them, the room resumed its rhythm, slowly, carefully, like a system recalibrating after a disruption it would never openly acknowledge. Glasses lifted again. Conversations returned. The piano found its melody. But something fundamental had changed, even if no one would name it. Because the most powerful shifts do not announce themselves with noise. They settle quietly into place, leaving behind a space where certainty used to live. And in that space, everyone in the room understood, whether they admitted it or not, that the balance they relied on was never as permanent as it appeared. The corridor door closed with a soft click, and just like that, Victor Liang was no longer part of the room. There was no announcement, no dramatic shift, just absence. And absence, when it belongs to someone who once held the center, does not go unnoticed. Inside the dining floor, the rhythm returned, but not quite the same. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone, quieter, more measured, as if everyone was recalibrating what they had just witnessed without ever saying it out loud. A man at the far table leaned in closer to his companion, his voice lowered, careful. A woman near the window adjusted her posture, her expression composed, but her eyes distant, replaying the moment in her own way. Phones lit up discreetly beneath the table edges, messages already forming narratives that would travel far beyond these walls before the night was over. Naomi remained where she was, just inside the edge of the corridor, her presence steady, unchanged. She did not follow. She did not watch the door. She simply stood there, grounded in a moment that had already completed its purpose. Behind her, the private room door opened once more. The woman in the charcoal suit stepped out, her expression calm, her movements efficient. She gave Naomi a brief nod, not congratulatory, not emotional, just acknowledgement. "It is done," she said quietly. Naomi nodded in return. No smile, no relief. Because this was never about a single outcome. It was about a process that had reached its point of truth. The man in the navy suit passed by a moment later, no longer observing, no longer positioned. His role had ended as seamlessly as it had begun. To anyone watching, he was just another guest leaving early. But the timing told a different story. Naomi turned back toward the dining floor, her eyes scanning the room one last time. The table where Victor had sat was already being reset. A new cloth, fresh glasses, clean lines, as if the space itself refused to hold memory. But people remember, even when rooms do not. She walked forward, her steps quiet, returning to the space she had always occupied, but not in the same way. A manager approached her, this time not whispering, not cautious. "Are you all right?" he asked again, his voice more direct now, more human. Naomi looked at him for a second, then nodded. "Yes," she said simply. And that was enough. Because strength does not always need explanation. Across the room, the piano shifted into a new melody, something lighter, almost hopeful, as if the night itself had decided to move on. Guests lifted their glasses again. Conversations found their rhythm. The city outside continued its endless motion, lights stretching across the skyline like nothing had changed. But something had. Not in the structure of the room. Not in the design of power. In the understanding of it. Naomi reached for a tray once more, lifting it with the same steady hands, the same quiet precision. To anyone watching, she was exactly what she had been at the beginning of the night. A waitress. Moving. Serving. Invisible. But invisibility, when chosen, is no longer weakness. It is control. And as she stepped back into the flow of the room, blending seamlessly into the rhythm she had always known, one truth settled quietly into place, deeper than any headline, stronger than any moment that could be recorded. He had wealth. He had influence. He had built a world that bent around him. But tonight, none of that defined the outcome. Because power, real power, is not measured by how loudly you command a room. It is revealed in the moment the room no longer answers to you. And Naomi Carter never needed to raise her voice to prove it.